What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Nerdy Professor podcast, where we talk about everything black, bold, and beautiful. I am your host, the Nerdy Professor, and in this series of episodes, we're going to discuss the social movements that people of African descent have been a part of, as well as the strategies and tactics used along the way. In this first episode, we're going to talk about the precursor of African American history and focus on the European nations that brought enslaved Africans to the New World. Let's get into it. So first, a slight history of Africa. The history of Africa began with the first hominids and archaic humans over 2 million years ago. The first one is the Homo habilis, aka the handyman. We call him the handyman because he used stone tools. Next, we have the Homo erectus, aka the upright man. We call it the upright man because it was the first upright human. And lastly, we have the Homo sapiens, the modern human, who came into existence around 300,000 years ago in East Africa. The earliest known record of written history is in ancient Egypt, then Nubia, Sahel, Maghreb, and the Horn of Africa. Due to the desertification of the Sahara, the history of North Africa became connected with the Middle East and Southern Europe, while the Bantu extension, more on that in a later episode, went south toward Central West Africa and the southern tip of the continent. In pre-colonial times, Africa had over 9,000 different nation states. Some notable pre-colonial states include ancient Egypt, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, the Ashanti Empire, which is my favorite, the Oyo Empire, the Ghana Empire, and plenty more. So with that precursor out of the way, we're going to fast forward a little bit to the Age of Discovery, aka the Age of Exploration, aka the One Piece era. The Age of Exploration shares similarities with One Piece. In One Piece, we find Luffy gathering his crew, sailing the Grand Line, searching for Gold Roger's treasure. Same as the Europeans that were setting out looking for gold, treasure, a life of freedom, a life of wealthiness. See, Europe was moving on up in the 15th century. There was an end to the Middle Ages, the start of the Renaissance, the Ottoman Turks took over the Byzantine, and the ending of the 100 Years' War between the Kingdom of France and England. The major players during the Age of Exploration are Spain, France, England, and Portugal. These European nations bordered the Atlantic Ocean, and they all had factors pushing them to explore the world. These European countries were seeking new trade routes to the Far East. They had the Silk Road, and it provided the goods that they wanted, but overland trade took way too long. So they wanted to find a quicker sea route. Another factor pushing them to explore were these powerful monarchs with abundant wealth and authority who funded the expeditions. This fueled competition in the European countries for economic control. Navigation and shipbuilding got a stat boost during this time as well, making it far easier to explore. Lastly, these European countries want to spread Christianity. So trade with the East was expensive and difficult. The Muslims and the Italians controlled the flow of trade and could cut it off at any point in time. The goods also went through many hands, and each hand raised the price. Later, after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire made it very difficult for them to do overland trading because of high taxes, or they would straight up block the Silk Road. Okay, so with that scene set, we know what's going on around this time period. We're going to focus on Portugal. In the early 1400s, the Portuguese sailed across the Strait of Gibraltar and attacked the northern Moroccan city of Ceuta. King John and his three sons, Edward, Peter, and Henry, led the charge and seized the city. This signaled the beginning of the Portuguese Empire era. Prince Henry, soon to be known as Henry the Navigator, created an informal school where he gathered mathematicians, sailors, astronomers, and anybody under the sun that could teach the art of sailing. Henry the Navigator had the goal of sailing across Africa to find Prester John. Now, who's Prester John? Prester John was this mythical king said to rule over Christian land in Asia and Africa. The Portuguese set up trade posts throughout the 1400s along the west side of Africa. This is where they were able to gain commodities like pepper, ivory, gold, and enslaved people. Side note, in the beginning, this form of slavery was not based on race, religion, creed, blah, blah, blah. Just, my people conquered your people, and you're going to work for me for free. So in 1444, slaves were brought back to Lisbon and paraded around the harbor for sale. From then, over 20,000 men, women, and children were traded in the city of Lisbon. Portugal used slave labor on the Madeira Islands and other Atlantic African islands for agricultural processing, like sugarcane and lumber. Other European countries were late to the game, but they soon caught up. The War of Roses was tying them up, but they'll hop in. European nations sent out numerous expeditions trying to get to the Far East. So by the end of the 1400s, Portugal's Vasco da Gama was able to get around Africa as well as set up a sea route to India. But the single most important discovery, quote unquote, of the age of exploration was Christopher Columbus stumbling upon the Americas. Columbus was an Italian navigator and adventurer looking to gain wealth via the spice trade. He lobbied different kingdoms to fund his plan to seek western passages to the East Indies. The Spanish monarchs Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand II funded his trip, and in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all know the rhyme. He landed on one of the Caribbean islands first and made 3 more journeys to the Americas during his lifetime. Columbus's ventures brought the new and old world closer together with the transfer of cultures, plants, food, animals, and diseases. Speaking of diseases, Europe was not a clean place at the time, and they brought a whole host of new diseases to the Americas, mainly smallpox. Now, smallpox decimated the indigenous population, along with the brutal treatment of the indigenous people. What followed Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World was an era of colonialism, as most European nations looked to get their hands on the New World and gain wealth. So why take enslaved Africans to the New World? Well, I'm glad you asked. The Portuguese and other European countries used slave labor in the American colonies because it was the quickest way to get rich and gain wealth. Probably because they was trying to get to the money like Nami. At the time, indentured servants and other European slaves required payment or some type of protection. But by using Native American and African slaves, they could cut costs, as in no cost, as in not pay them at all. Indigenous Americans had a better chance of resisting the harsh treatment that the Europeans placed upon them because they could revolt or escape on the land that they already knew. And the Europeans had no idea how to navigate this land without them. So by transporting enslaved Africans to the new colonies, they reduced the chance of escape because Africans were unfamiliar with the terrain, although escaping and joining their surrounding native populations was not uncommon. So if you take nothing from this episode, take this. Africa is the birthplace of man. Don't argue with me, argue with your mama. Go look it up for yourself. Whatever. This all started because the known world was looking to get rich and get a hold of commodities from South Asia, like fabric and spices and gold. During the Age of Exploration, Portugal was the first European power to begin building colonial power by looking for routes to India, but finding the west coast of Africa trading gold, slaves, and food. Also, trading with Portugal and other European countries helped the African economy for a short term. Think about it like this. From the perspective of a 15th century African, they were making trade connections and expanding their market. And in return, the Africans were able to gain access to goods like guns, alcohol, and textiles. On the other hand, European nations received gold, slaves for free labor, and spices for food preservation. The age of exploration brought about considerable cultural exchange, though fraught with conflict and exploitation. In the world of One Piece, cultural exchange takes center stage as characters encounter fishmen, giants, or even talking animals. Shout out to Chopper. Each encounter challenges perspectives, fosters understanding, and sometimes sparks conflict, like when Luffy punched the color off that celestial dragon. European colonization left enduring impacts on indigenous societies, shaping economies, politics, and cultures across continents. The age of exploration raises ethical considerations, colonialism, exploitation of resources, and the treatment of indigenous people. Similarly, One Piece explores themes of oppression, freedom, colonialism, exploitation, and justice. Characters confront systemic corruption with the world government, challenge societal norms, and fight for the rights of marginalized groups, shadowing real-world problems in a fictional context. The trauma that European people caused in West Africa spread throughout the continent as the slave trade made it to the Caribbean islands and later the Americas. And of course, like any other humans, enslaved Africans didn't take that trauma lightly, and they continuously fought back, and their descendants are still fighting back to this day. Alright y'all, that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining. Drop a like, drop a comment, subscribe to the show, and let me know what you think I should cover next. Until next time, peace.